November 8th arrived with the kind of Boston cold that turned breath into visible clouds and made fingers numb within seconds of leaving heated spaces. Grayson Alexander Hartwell stood before the full-length mirror in his bedroom, the one Eloise had insisted they buy from that antique shop in Beacon Hill 3 months before the accident changed everything. His fingers worked an Hermes tie into a Windsor knot while his mind catalogued every reason this evening would end in disaster. The townhouse around him sat silent except for the rhythmic hiss of radiators fighting November's assault and the distant sound of his daughter's feet padding across century-old hardwood floors. The bedroom still carried traces of Eloise everywhere. Her perfume bottles lined up on the dresser like soldiers. She'd never dismissed the book on her nightstand open to page 147. A bookmark he'd never moved, because moving it meant admitting she wasn't coming back to finish the story. Briar appeared in the doorway wearing flannel pajamas decorated with constellations 9 years old, and already carrying the kind of observational skills that made lying to her impossible. Her dark hair fell loose around shoulders that would someday match her mother's elegant frame if genetics kept their promises and grief didn't stunt growth in ways doctors couldn't measure. "You look nervous?" Her voice carried the particular clarity of children who'd learned too young to read adult emotions. Grayson adjusted the tie one final time, buying precious seconds to compose his face into something resembling paternal confidence. "It's just dinner, sweetheart. It's a blind date. Uncle Roland told me everything." Briar climbed onto the bed that Eloise had ordered from some French catalog, settling cross-legged on top of the duvet. "He showed me her picture when he came by yesterday. She looks kind." The revelation shouldn't have surprised him. Roland Pierce had been his business partner for 12 years. His closest friend for 15, and possessed exactly zero boundaries when it came to matters he deemed important. Apparently, Grayson's romantic resurrection qualified as critically important. "Uncle Roland needs to learn about privacy and appropriate boundaries. He says you need to learn about living instead of just existing." Briar tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that reminded him painfully of Eloise during their early courtship, back when she was still deciding whether a 25-year-old with nothing but ambition and a hastily drafted business plan deserved her attention. "Mommy would want you to be happy. She told me so." The words landed like they always did, a perfect strike to the center of his chest where 4 years of guilt had built permanent residence. 4 years since December 23, 2020, when black ice and catastrophically bad timing conspired to end something that should have lasted decades. 4 years since he'd chosen an $80 million real estate deal over driving his wife home from their company's Christmas party. Grayson crossed to the bed and sat beside his daughter, the mattress dipping under his weight. He reached for her hand, small and warm and impossibly alive in a way that still sometimes surprised him. "Your mother would want a lot of things. She'd want you to try." Briar's voice carried the kind of certainty that only children possessed, absolute faith in dead mothers' wishes and the universe's fundamental fairness. "Just try, Daddy." That's all she ever asked. The drive to Evergreen Steakhouse took 23 minutes through Saturday evening traffic, his Mercedes S-Class gliding through intersections with the kind of smooth precision that money bought and guilt couldn't quite tarnish. Roland had orchestrated this blind date 3 weeks ago during a quarterly review meeting that had somehow devolved into a full-scale intervention about Grayson's personal life. "Your revenue is up 18% year over year. But you look like death warmed over," his partner had announced with characteristic bluntness, completely ignoring the financial projections displayed on the conference room screen. "You need to do something besides work and parent. You need to remember you're still alive and not just a walking memorial to your dead wife." The words had stung because they were accurate. Somewhere in the past 4 years, Grayson had stopped living and started merely existing, going through the motions of life without actually participating in it. Work consumed his days, Briar occupied his evenings, and the empty hours between midnight and dawn were spent either in his office reviewing contracts or lying in bed staring at the ceiling and cataloging his failures. The restaurant appeared on his right, all warm lighting and tasteful signage designed to suggest old money elegance without the stuffiness that came with actual old money. Evergreen was the kind of establishment where business deals were sealed over perfectly cooked steaks and romantic milestones were celebrated with expensive wine. Grayson had been here dozens of times for client dinners and power lunches, but never for a date, never for anything that required actual emotional vulnerability instead of carefully calculated corporate charm. Inside, the hostess greeted him with professional warmth that faltered slightly when she checked her reservation list. She was young, maybe 23 or 24, with the kind of nervous efficiency that suggested recent employment and genuine concern about making mistakes. "Mr. Hartwell, yes, table 7. Your party called approximately 30 minutes ago to let us know she's running late due to car trouble. She asked us to convey that she's arranging alternative transportation and should be here within 45 minutes to an hour. Would you prefer to wait at the table or at the bar?" The information filtered slowly through the anxiety that had been building since he'd agreed to this ridiculous idea. His blind date was late. The woman named Marlo Sullivan, who worked as an emergency room nurse and looked, according to the single photograph Roland had shown him on his phone, like someone who smiled easily despite carrying her own weight of grief and loss. "I'll wait at the table, thank you." The hostess led him through the main dining room past couples leaning close over candlelight and business associates conducting deals over appetizers and wine. Table 7 sat near the back, positioned beside a fireplace that crackled with real wood. Because Evergreen didn't believe in gas logs or artificial ambiance, the location offered privacy without complete isolation, warmth without stuffiness, exactly the kind of careful staging that made first dates feel like elaborate performance art. Grayson settled into his chair and tried desperately to remember how dating actually worked. The mechanics escaped him completely. 4 years was geological time in relationship terms, and before that he'd been married for 8 years. And before that, so young and stupid that his courtship of Eloise barely qualified as traditional dating so much as sustained begging until she agreed to take him seriously. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Briar sent from her iPad despite his explicit rules about screen time after 8 p.m. "Good luck, Daddy. Don't talk about work too much. Ask her questions about herself. People like when you're genuinely interested in them instead of just waiting for your turn to talk." When exactly had his 9-year-old daughter become the adult in their relationship? Grayson typed back a quick acknowledgement, silenced his phone completely, and slipped it back into his pocket with a sense of finality. He surveyed the dining room with the careful focus of someone preparing for corporate negotiations. A woman sat alone at a nearby table, blonde hair catching the firelight in a way that seemed almost deliberate, wearing a green dress that managed to look both elegant and effortless. She was reviewing some kind of paperwork, her attention focused intently on whatever documents were spread before her, her posture suggesting someone completely comfortable in their own skin. Roland had specifically said blonde hair. He'd mentioned a green dress. He'd said the reservation would be for a table near the fireplace because Marlo had mentioned liking the ambiance of real fires. Grayson stood before his brain had fully processed the decision, crossing the space between tables with the same determined stride he brought to closing complicated real estate deals. The woman looked up as he approached, surprise flickering across her face before settling into a warm, welcoming smile that made something in his chest unknot slightly. "Marlo?" "Yes, of course." She gestured gracefully to the empty chair across from her. "You must be Grayson. Please sit down. I'm so glad you found the table." Relief washed through him in waves, carrying away some of the crushing anxiety that had been building in his shoulders since agreeing to this evening's plan. This was going to be fun. This was going to be good. She seemed approachable and kind. Nothing like the stilted awkwardness he'd been dreading for the past 3 days. Grayson sat folding his hands on the table to keep from fidgeting like a nervous teenager. Up close, she looked older than her photograph had suggested, maybe mid-40s rather than late 30s, with laugh lines around her eyes and the kind of easy confidence that came from genuine life experience rather than carefully cultivated performance. "I'm very glad you made it despite the late notice." Grayson said, the words coming out more earnest than he'd intended. I wasn't entirely sure this was a good idea when Roland first suggested it. Blind dates are always something of a gamble, aren't they? She set aside whatever paperwork she'd been reviewing, giving him her complete attention in a way that felt simultaneously flattering and slightly unnerving. But Roland speaks very highly of you. He's quite invested in your happiness, it seems. Roland is invested in everyone's business, whether they want him to be or not. Grayson felt himself relaxing incrementally, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, making the knot in his chest loosen further. Subtlety has never been his strong suit, but he means well. They fell into conversation with surprising ease. Grayson found himself talking about Briar without the usual careful editing he employed around strangers, about the strange and often terrifying territory of raising a daughter alone, about the guilt that came from working too many hours but not knowing any other way to provide the kind of life Eloise would have wanted for their child, about the constant fear that he was fundamentally failing at the most important job he'd ever have. The woman listened with the kind of careful attention that felt genuine rather than performed, nodding at appropriate moments and asking follow-up questions that demonstrated she was actually processing what he said, rather than just politely waiting for her turn to speak. Being a single parent must be incredibly challenging, she offered after he'd talked himself into a natural pause. I can't even imagine trying to do it after the kind of devastating loss you've experienced. You learn to compartmentalize everything, Grayson admitted, tracing the edge of his water glass with one finger. Work intensely during business hours, parent as best you can in the evenings, collapse after she's asleep, then repeat the entire cycle the next day. It's not particularly elegant or healthy, but it functions well enough. That sounds incredibly lonely, though. The observation hit harder than casual sympathy should have, probably because it was entirely accurate. Sometimes it is. Most of the time, honestly. But Briar needs stability and consistency more than she needs a father who's emotionally available, right? I'm not entirely sure those two things are actually mutually exclusive. The woman's voice carried gentle challenge rather than harsh judgment. Children are remarkably perceptive. They know when we're just going through the motions versus actually being present. Grayson thought about Briar's comment earlier that evening about Clara, the nanny, mentioning that he'd been sleeping in his office again. You sound like you have personal experience with that particular dynamic. A different kind of experience, perhaps. She glanced briefly at her paperwork again, something flickering across her face too quickly to interpret. But yes, some experience with the difference between functioning and actually living. They continued talking. She asked thoughtful questions about his work, and he found himself explaining Hartwell Properties with more candor than he usually brought to business discussions. Real estate development sounded glamorous and exciting, until you got into the actual details, the endless municipal permits and zoning disputes and community pushback that characterized every single project regardless of scope or intention. Do you genuinely enjoy it? She leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table in a way that suggested genuine intellectual curiosity rather than polite small talk. The actual building and creating, I mean, not just the financial returns. I used to enjoy it tremendously. The admission surprised him with its honesty. When I first started the company, it was genuinely about creating spaces where people would want to live and work. Offices that didn't feel soul-crushing. Residential buildings with actual architectural character. Now it's become mostly about profit margins and market analysis and shareholder returns. What changed beyond the obvious tragedy, I mean? Grayson knew the answer, but saying it aloud felt uncomfortably like failure. Eloise died, and I turned myself into exactly the kind of ruthless businessman I used to openly mock. The kind who sees everything as numbers and ROI instead of actual neighborhoods and human communities. The woman's expression softened with sympathy that didn't feel performative or calculated. Grief changes us in profound ways. Sometimes we don't even recognize what we've become until someone else points it out clearly. Is that what you're doing right now? Pointing out what I've become. Just making an observation based on what you're telling me. She smiled again, that same warm expression that made her eyes crinkle attractively. Roland mentioned you needed someone who wouldn't let you hide behind comfortable work talk and corporate deflection. Roland says entirely too many things about entirely too many subjects. Perhaps, but he clearly cares deeply about you and wants you to be happy. He's extraordinarily nosy and refuses to respect reasonable boundaries. Both of those things can be simultaneously true. Grayson found himself actually laughing, a genuine sound of amusement that felt rusty and unfamiliar from disuse. When was the last time he'd laughed at something that wasn't one of Briar's deliberately terrible dad jokes? The sound startled him enough that he cut it off quickly, suddenly self-conscious about displaying too much genuine emotion. "I'm sorry, I don't usually... This isn't something I do very often anymore. Laugh or apologize for laughing. Either one. Both, I suppose." He rubbed his face, feeling the day's stubble scratch roughly against his palm. "I'm probably absolutely terrible company right now. You're honest company, which is considerably rarer than you might think." The woman glanced at her phone as it buzzed insistently against the table, her expression shifting subtly from open and relaxed to concerned and focused. "I apologize, but I really do need to check this message." She read whatever had come through, her entire posture changing in ways that telegraphed urgency and concern. When she looked up, apology was written clearly across her features in a way that made Grayson's stomach sink with disappointment. "I'm terribly sorry, but there's something I need to handle immediately. A work emergency that can't wait. Could you give me just a few minutes to deal with this?" "Of course, absolutely. Take whatever time you need." She stood gracefully, gathering the papers she'd been reviewing when he first approached, and walked toward the back of the restaurant with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly where she was going and what needed to be done. Grayson watched her disappear through a door clearly marked staff only. Confusion starting to creep in around the edges of his earlier relief and comfort. He sat alone at the table, staring at the empty chair across from him, and feeling the familiar weight of solitude settle back onto his shoulders, like a heavy coat he couldn't quite shake off. Maybe he'd fundamentally misread everything about this interaction. Maybe this was her practiced and polite way of ending a conversation that had become uncomfortable or tedious. He should have known better than to hope for anything different, should have known that 4 years of emotional isolation couldn't be overcome with one pleasant conversation. Grayson was actively reaching for his coat when the young hostess approached his table again, that same nervous smile firmly in place. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to let you know that we received a call from Ms. Sullivan about 30 minutes ago. Apparently her car broke down on Interstate 90 near the Newton exit because of some mechanical issue. She's arranged for Tupperway to tow it, and she's getting alternative transportation to the restaurant, but she asked us to please let her date know that she's running quite late and she's very sorry for the inconvenience." The words hit Grayson like a series of physical blows, each one landing with devastating precision. Ms. Sullivan. Marlo Sullivan. The woman he'd just spent the past 20 minutes pouring his heart out to, confessing his deepest failures and fears to, wasn't his blind date at all. Heat crawled up Grayson's neck as the full magnitude of his mistake became horrifyingly clear. He'd approached the wrong table entirely. He'd sat down uninvited with a complete stranger. He'd told this woman about Eloise and Briar and his fundamental inadequacy as both a businessman and a father, and she'd listened with such patience and kindness, because she was either too polite or too shocked to correct his obvious and mortifying error. The hostess continued, oblivious to his internal collapse. She said she should be here within the next 30 to 40 minutes, depending on traffic conditions. Would you still like to wait for her, or would you prefer to reschedule for another evening? Grayson looked desperately toward the kitchen area where the blonde woman had disappeared, his mind racing through the implications. She must have realized his mistake at some point during their conversation. She'd listened to him ramble about grief and guilt and failure, all while knowing he'd confused her with someone else entirely. The blonde woman emerged from the kitchen at that precise moment, professional composure restored to her features. She caught sight of Grayson's face, which must have clearly displayed his horror and humiliation, and understanding dawned in her expression, followed quickly by sympathy. She walked over, moving with the confidence of someone completely at ease in this environment. "Mr. Hartwell, I think there's been a rather significant misunderstanding between us." "You're not Marlo Sullivan." Grayson's voice came out strangled and mortified. "No, I'm afraid not. I'm Claudia Morrison, the restaurant manager." Her smile held genuine kindness rather than mockery or judgment. "When I saw you approaching my table, I assumed Roland Pierce had sent you to discuss the ongoing issues we've been having with our wine supplier. He's one of our investors, and we've been trying to schedule a meeting about inventory for the past 2 weeks." The explanation made terrible, perfect sense. Grayson closed his eyes, briefly willing the floor to please just open up and swallow him whole. "I am so incredibly sorry. I saw blonde hair and a green dress and a table near the fireplace, and I just assumed. It's completely understandable." Claudia's expression remained kind and patient. "I realized something was off when you started talking about your late wife and your daughter, but by then you seemed so relieved to be having a comfortable conversation that I didn't want to embarrass you by pointing out the error. I thought perhaps you were just making small talk before transitioning to business discussion. This is absolutely mortifying. It's actually rather endearing in a way." Claudia squeezed his shoulder gently. "For what it's worth, you seem like a genuinely good man who's trying his very best under difficult circumstances. Your actual date is going to be very lucky to meet you." She walked away before Grayson could formulate any kind of coherent response, leaving him alone at table 7 with his complete humiliation and the decision about whether to stay or flee immediately. The hostess was still standing nearby, waiting patiently for his answer about whether he wanted to continue waiting. "Sir, should I let Ms. Sullivan know you'll be here when she arrives?" Every instinct Grayson possessed screamed at him to leave immediately, to escape this restaurant before he could embarrass himself any further. But something made him hesitate. Maybe Briar's text message about trying, maybe Eloise's voice in his memory telling him to be brave, maybe just exhaustion from 4 years of taking the safe and easy path. "Yes," he heard himself say. "Please tell her I'll be waiting at the table." The hostess smiled with obvious relief and hurried away. Grayson sat down, heavily ordered water from a passing server, and resigned himself to 45 more minutes of contemplating his spectacular capacity for humiliation. He pulled out his phone and typed a message to Roland. "I sat at the wrong table and had a 20-minute conversation with the restaurant manager before realizing my actual date hasn't arrived yet. If this evening gets any worse, I'm blaming you entirely." Roland's response came almost immediately. "That's the funniest thing I've heard all month. Please tell me you're staying anyway." Grayson: "Against my better judgment, yes." Roland: "Good. Marlo is worth the embarrassment, trust me." The minutes crawled past with excruciating slowness. Grayson checked his watch repeatedly, convinced that time had somehow stopped or was moving backward. Other diners came and went, the restaurant filling steadily with Saturday evening crowds. He sat alone at his table, sipping water and trying not to think about how Claudia Morrison now knew far too much about his personal failures. At 8:27 p.m., 47 minutes after the hostess had informed him about the delay, the front door of Evergreen Steakhouse slammed open with enough force to make heads turn throughout the dining room. Cold November air rushed in, carrying swirling snow and a figure that stumbled more than walked through the entrance. The woman was absolutely soaked through, her hair plastered against her face and neck, her coat dripping water onto the hardwood floors in steady streams. She was shaking visibly, either from cold or physical exertion, or both. Her eyes scanned the dining room with desperate intensity until they landed on Grayson, and she started walking toward him with determined purpose. She reached his table and stopped breathing hard enough that her words came out in ragged gasps. Up close, Grayson could see that she looked younger than Claudia, probably early 30s, with brown hair that was several shades darker from being completely wet. Her eyes reflected bone-deep exhaustion mixed with fierce determination. "I am so sorry I'm late." The words tumbled out in one breathless rush. "My car completely died on the Mass Pike near the Newton exit. Apopoe took absolutely forever to respond. The tow truck driver could only take me as far as the garage in Alston. I tried to get a lift, but the first driver got completely lost, and then I just walked the last 2 miles through the storm because I promised I would be here, and I don't break my promises to people." Grayson stood automatically, years of ingrained manners overriding his shock and surprise. "You walked 2 miles in this weather? That's completely insane, irrational, slightly unhinged." She managed a weak smile despite her obvious discomfort. "Yes, probably all of those things, but I said I'd be here." Claudia Morrison appeared at their table with seemingly supernatural timing, carrying a thick wool blanket and a large mug of something hot and steaming. She draped the blanket around the woman's trembling shoulders with practiced efficiency that spoke of years in the hospitality industry. "You must be Ms. Sullivan." Claudia's voice held genuine warmth and concern. "You poor thing. Please sit down immediately before you collapse from hypothermia. I've brought hot chocolate. Drink it slowly." Marlo Sullivan. His actual blind date. The woman who had just walked 2 miles through a November blizzard in Boston because she'd made a promise to show up for dinner with a complete stranger. Grayson helped her into the chair across from him, his hands briefly touching her shoulders through the damp fabric of her coat. She was shaking violently, and he could feel the cold radiating from her body even through the layers of wet clothing. Her nurse's scrubs were clearly visible beneath her coat, suggesting she'd come directly from a hospital shift without time to change into something more appropriate for a date. Claudia caught Grayson's eye over Marlo's bowed head and gave him a knowing, encouraging smile before walking away discreetly to give them privacy. Marlo wrapped both hands around the mug of hot chocolate like it was a lifeline, pulling the blanket more tightly around her shoulders with visible relief. "I'm Marlo, in case that somehow wasn't completely obvious from my dramatic and soggy entrance. You must be Grayson. I'm genuinely sorry for being so terribly late, and for being soaking wet, and for generally being a complete disaster. Please don't apologize for any of that." Grayson settled back into his own chair, completely unable to look away from this woman who had just done something utterly irrational in service of keeping a promise to a stranger. "Are you actually okay? Do you need medical attention, or—" "I'm fine, I promise, just cold and wet and feeling extremely mortified." She took a careful sip of the hot chocolate, and some of the tension visibly left her shoulders as warmth began spreading through her body. "This really isn't how I imagined this evening starting, I have to say. I've had quite an interesting evening myself, actually." The understatement felt massive, but Grayson didn't want to immediately launch into the story about Claudia. "You said you're a nurse." Marlo glanced down at her visible scrubs with a rueful expression. "Emergency room at Massachusetts General Hospital. I just finished a 14-hour shift that was supposed to end at 6, but we had a last-minute trauma case that kept me until almost 7. I went home quickly to change and grab my coat, and that's when my car decided to stage its rebellion against me." "That sounds like an incredibly long and difficult day even before the car trouble." "It's fairly normal for healthcare, unfortunately." She took another sip of hot chocolate, and Grayson noticed her hands were starting to shake slightly less. "Reasonable working hours aren't really a concept the medical field believes in very strongly. I can relate to that, although in a very different industry and for much less noble reasons." Grayson felt himself relaxing incrementally. The unreasonable hours part, I mean, not the saving lives part. Marlo's lips quirked upward in what might have been the beginning of real amusement. "At least you're honest about it. Most people try to make their work sound considerably more glamorous and important than it actually is." They started talking more naturally, the awkwardness gradually dissolving as they found their rhythm. Grayson felt compelled to confess about his earlier mistake about sitting at the wrong table and having a 20-minute conversation with Claudia Morrison while thinking she was his blind date. Marlo's reaction was immediate laughter, genuine and surprised and completely without judgment. "Are you absolutely serious right now?" I wish I weren't, but yes, completely serious. She was wearing a green dress and sitting near the fireplace, and I just assumed. Grayson trailed off, shaking his head at his own idiocy. So if this date goes badly from here, at least it absolutely cannot be more awkward or embarrassing than that confession. Oh, I don't know about that. Marlowe's smile reached her eyes this time. I walked 2 miles through a blizzard and showed up looking like I just crawled out of a river. I think we're pretty evenly matched in the awkward and embarrassing department. The conversation flowed more easily after that. They talked about their work. Grayson explained Hartwell Properties and commercial real estate development, while Marlowe described the organized chaos of emergency room nursing. They talked about their children. Grayson's daughter, Briar, who was 9 years old and brilliant and perpetually worried about her father's emotional well-being, and Marlowe's son, Beckett, who was 8 and serious beyond his years, and carried the weight of loss with heartbreaking awareness. They carefully avoided directly mentioning their deceased spouses at first, dancing around the topic with the practiced caution of people who'd learned that grief made others uncomfortable. Then Marlowe mentioned someone I lost a few years ago in passing, and Grayson responded with a quiet, "Me too," and suddenly they had shared understanding that required no further elaboration or explanation. By 9:45, the restaurant was clearly preparing to close for the evening. Staff members were cleaning tables around them with polite discretion that suggested Claudia had told them to give the couple as much time and space as they needed. Marlowe looked reluctant when she finally stood to leave. "I really should go. I have an early shift tomorrow morning at 6, and I still need to figure out my car situation and—" She trailed off, looking genuinely regretful about ending the evening. "Your car is still at the garage in Alston." "Yes, and I'll need to take the T to get home, which is going to take forever at this hour with the weekend schedule, but it's fine. Let me drive you home." The offer came out before Grayson could second-guess the impulse. "Please, it's late and you've had an incredibly long day, and I would genuinely feel much better knowing you got home safely." Marlowe studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing the offer against whatever internal calculations she was making about safety and appropriateness and social conventions. "You really don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to, but I genuinely want to if you're comfortable with it." "Okay," she said finally with a small nod of acceptance. "Thank you. That's very kind." Grayson left cash on the table for their untouched meals and a generous tip for the waitstaff who'd given them space and privacy. On their way out, Claudia Morrison caught his eye from behind the bar and gave him a subtle thumbs-up gesture that made him feel simultaneously embarrassed and oddly grateful for her earlier patience with his mistake. Outside, November had turned brutally cold, the kind of temperature that made exposed skin sting within seconds. Fresh snow covered everything in a pristine white blanket that would turn to gray slush by morning. Grayson's Mercedes sat in the parking lot across the street, and Marlowe stopped short when she saw it. "That's your car." Something flickered across her face too quickly for him to fully interpret. "Company car, technically. I know it's ridiculously excessive. It's just very different from what I'm used to, that's all." She climbed into the passenger seat, carefully running one hand over leather upholstery that probably cost more than her monthly rent. "My Toyota is almost 20 years old and smells perpetually like old French fries because Beckett smuggles food despite my extremely explicit rules against car snacking. Briar once hid a juice box in the back seat and it exploded during a heat wave last summer." Grayson started the engine and heat flooded the cabin immediately. "The professional detailing to remove the smell cost $400. $400 just for cleaning a car." Marlowe's voice held genuine disbelief. "I told you. Ridiculously excessive." He pulled out of the parking lot carefully. "Where am I taking you?" Marlowe gave him an address in Dorchester that made Grayson's mental map of Boston light up with immediate concern. Not the absolute worst neighborhood in the city, but definitely not a safe one, especially late at night. She seemed to read his thoughts directly from his expression. It's not Beacon Hill, obviously, but the rent is actually affordable and Beckett's school is within walking distance, which matters. I wasn't judging or making assumptions. Everyone judges even when they're trying not to. It's fine and perfectly understandable. She settled back into the seat, exhaustion finally catching up with her now that she was warm and safe. We do what we can with what we have available to us. The drive took 17 minutes through mostly empty streets, snow making everything feel muffled and distant and somehow more intimate. They didn't talk much during the drive, but the silence felt companionable rather than awkward or uncomfortable. Grayson found himself hyper-aware of Marlowe's presence beside him, the sound of her breathing gradually evening out the way she watched Boston slide past the window with tired eyes. Dorchester revealed itself gradually as they drove, the buildings getting progressively older and more worn. The streetlights becoming less consistent. The general atmosphere shifting from curated prosperity to practical survival. Marlowe's building appeared on the right side of the street, a brick structure that had probably been genuinely handsome back in the 1950s and was now just holding on through sheer structural determination. Grayson pulled to the curb and left the engine running to keep the heat flowing. Marlowe didn't immediately move to leave her hand resting on the door handle but not actually pulling it. "This was weird, right?" Her voice came soft in the enclosed space of the car. "Good weird, definitely, but still objectively weird. Very, very weird." Grayson turned slightly to face her more directly. "You walked 2 miles through a November blizzard to have dinner with a complete stranger you'd never met before. And you talked to the wrong person for 20 minutes but decided to stay and wait anyway when you realized your mistake." Marlowe turned to face him as well, their eyes meeting in the dim light from the dashboard. "Most people would have just left out of sheer embarrassment. I almost did leave, honestly." "What made you decide to stay?" Grayson thought about Breyer's text message, about trying harder, about Eloise's voice in his memory telling him to be brave and take risks, about 4 years spent choosing the safe and easy path that led absolutely nowhere. Stubbornness, maybe, or hope, or just complete stupidity, probably some combination of all three. "That sounds extremely familiar, actually." Marlowe smiled and the expression reached her eyes properly for the first time all evening. "So, would you potentially want to do this again sometime, or was tonight's chaos enough adventure for you?" "I would genuinely like to see you again." The certainty in Grayson's voice surprised even himself. "Very much, actually, if you're willing to risk another evening with me." "I think I can probably handle that particular risk." She opened the door and cold air rushed into the warm car immediately. "Thank you for driving me all the way home, and for not running away when I showed up looking like I'd gone swimming fully clothed. Thank you for showing up at all, especially after everything that went wrong." Grayson meant it completely and sincerely. That took real determination and integrity. Marlowe paused halfway out of the car, then ducked her head back inside with a slightly mischievous expression. "You don't actually have my phone number yet, you realize?" "Roland has it. I'll get it from him first thing tomorrow." "Roland really does know absolutely everything about everyone, doesn't he?" "Unfortunately, yes. Privacy is a completely foreign concept to him." She laughed and climbed out fully, then stood by the passenger door for a moment looking back at him. "Grayson, I'm genuinely glad I came tonight, even with the car breaking down and the weather and the general disaster of everything." "Me too, genuinely." He watched her walk carefully to her building's entrance, waiting until she'd disappeared safely inside before pulling away from the curb. The drive back to Beacon Hill felt considerably longer than the drive out to Dorchester, Boston, transforming back into familiar and comfortable territory. While Grayson's mind replayed every moment of the evening's completely unexpected turns. His phone rang just as he was pulling into his garage. Breyer calling from her iPad despite being supposed to be asleep over an hour ago. "Daddy, how did everything go? Was it terrible? Are you okay?" Grayson killed the engine and sat in the darkness of his garage considering how to answer that multifaceted question. "It went better than I expected, honestly. Very different from what I thought would happen, but better." Do you like her, the real her, I mean? I think I do, yes, maybe. It's all very complicated. Is it complicated because of Mom? The question came out small and worried. The question landed exactly where it always did, carrying the particular weight that only questions from grieving children could carry. Yes, partly because of Mom, and partly just because it's been such a long time since I've thought about any of this and I don't really remember how it's supposed to work. Mom would want you to be happy, though. Briar's voice carried absolute conviction and certainty. She told me that specifically before she died. She said that taking care of yourself was actually the very best way to take care of me. Grayson closed his eyes against the sudden sting of tears, grief, and gratitude mixing into something that felt almost like permission from beyond the grave. When exactly did you get to be so wise and insightful? I've always been wise and insightful, Daddy. You just notice it more when it's convenient for you. Static crackled across the connection briefly. So are you going to see her again, the nurse lady? I think so, yes. If she'll agree to it after tonight's chaos. Of course she will. You're great, Daddy. You just forget that sometimes. She yawned audibly. I'm going to sleep now. Love you. Love you too, sweetheart. Sweet dreams. They hung up and Grayson sat alone in his garage for several more minutes, letting the car's cooling engine tick rhythmically in the silence. 4 years. 4 entire years of grief and guilt and simply going through the motions of existence without actually living. 4 years of telling himself that work and parenting were sufficient, that wanting anything more made him selfish or disloyal or fundamentally weak. But tonight, sitting in Evergreen Steakhouse talking to first the wrong person, and then the right one, watching Marlowe's face as she described her own struggles and losses, feeling the unexpected warmth of human connection he'd thought was gone forever. Something had shifted inside him. Not the grief itself, which would never completely leave and probably shouldn't, but maybe his relationship to that grief, the way he carried it, the possibility that life could somehow contain both profound sorrow for what was lost and genuine hope for what might still be found. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Marlowe. Made it inside safely. Thank you again for tonight and for being so kind. Grayson saved the contact information immediately, staring at her name on his screen like it held some kind of secret meaning. Tomorrow he would go back to being CEO of Hartwell Properties, back to endless meetings and complicated deals and the grinding machinery of business. Tomorrow he would be Briar's father again, packing lunches and checking homework and trying desperately to remember what normal parenting actually looked like. But tonight, sitting in his garage with November snow falling steadily outside and a near stranger's number saved in his phone, Grayson Alexander Hartwell let himself feel something he'd been absolutely certain was gone forever and would never return. Hope. Morning arrived with the particular crystalline clarity that always followed significant snowfall, Boston rendered impossibly clean and sharp under a sky scrubbed completely blue by yesterday's storm. Grayson woke in his actual bed for the first time in 3 weeks, having deliberately chosen real sleep over his usual routine of passing out on the leather couch in his home office where financial spreadsheets couldn't ambush him with uncomfortable questions about whether he was doing enough, being enough, surviving enough to justify the space he occupied. Briar found him in the kitchen attempting breakfast with the kind of determined incompetence that came from years of relying almost exclusively on Clara's professional cooking. Eggs sizzled violently in a pan, their edges browning far too quickly, while bread produced alarming amounts of smoke from a toaster that had never quite recovered from the bagel incident 3 months prior. His daughter surveyed the culinary damage with the particular brand of pragmatism that 9-year-olds developed when forced to become more mature than their years warranted. She was wearing her constellation pajamas and her hair fell in sleep-tangled waves around her shoulders. You're making breakfast yourself? It was a statement rather than a question. This means last night's date either went really, really well or spectacularly, catastrophically badly. Why can't it simply mean that I wanted to cook breakfast for my daughter on a Sunday morning? Because you never want to cook anything ever. That's literally why you pay Clara an extremely generous salary to want to cook for us. Briar climbed onto one of the kitchen bar stools with practiced ease. So which one is it? Grayson slid a plate across the marble countertop, the eggs slightly burned around the edges but at least technically edible by most reasonable standards. It went well, I think. We're planning to see each other again soon. How soon is soon? I don't know the exact timing yet, probably within the next few days. Briar attacked her breakfast with the appetite of someone who'd learned early that complaining about food quality usually meant being responsible for preparing it yourself. Between enthusiastic bites, she subjected him to the kind of detailed interrogation that would make professional prosecutors jealous. What did Marlowe look like in person? What specific topics did they discuss? Did he laugh genuinely? Did she laugh? Were there metaphorical fireworks like in romantic movies? Fireworks, really? That's what happens in every single movie when people fall in love. There are always fireworks or shooting stars or something equally dramatic and symbolic. She swallowed a mouthful of eggs. So were there fireworks? Real actual life doesn't work anything like movies, sweetheart. Grayson pushed his own eggs around his plate without much appetite. Real life is considerably messier and slower and doesn't come conveniently equipped with a soundtrack to tell you how you're supposed to feel. But do you actually like her as a real person? The question absolutely deserved complete honesty. Grayson thought carefully about Marlowe walking determinedly through a blizzard to keep a promise about her hand. Briefly in his across a restaurant table about the way she'd understood loss and grief without requiring lengthy explanations or awkward condolences. Yes, he said finally. I genuinely like her quite a lot. Good. Briar finished her eggs and deposited her plate in the sink with a clatter that suggested strong opinions about dishwashers. I'm really glad you're actually trying instead of just giving up Daddy. Mom would be glad too. She left for her bedroom to get properly dressed for the day, leaving Grayson alone with burned eggs and the ghost of Eloise's voice, reminding him that simply surviving wasn't remotely the same thing as actually living. His phone buzzed just as he was scrubbing the frying pan. A text from Marlowe sent with the kind of early morning timing that suggested she was already awake and possibly caffeinated good morning. Thank you again for last night and for being so patient with all the chaos. I had a considerably better time than I expected to have while soaking wet and mortified. Grayson found himself actually smiling at his phone screen like a teenager, fingers hovering over the keyboard while he constructed and then immediately discarded several potential responses that ranged from too casual to too intense. Finally, he settled on something middle ground. The pleasure was entirely mine. I'd genuinely like to see you again soon if you're willing to risk another evening with me and whatever disasters it might bring. Her response came within minutes, fast enough to suggest she'd been waiting for his reply. I think I can probably handle that particular risk. When were you thinking? Grayson checked his mental calendar, shuffling meetings that could theoretically be moved and obligations that absolutely couldn't. Tomorrow evening, Marlowe. That works perfectly for me, though I should probably warn you in advance that my car is still at the garage and won't be ready until at least Thursday. Transportation might be complicated. Grayson, I'll pick you up. 7 o'clock. Marlowe. 7 is perfect, but nothing fancy this time, please. I'd genuinely like to see you in a place where I don't feel completely underdressed and out of my element. The request made something unknot in Grayson's chest. Know any good diners in the area, Marlowe? I know several genuinely excellent diners, actually. Let me pick the specific place. You just show up and be yourself. Grayson, deal. Looking forward to it. Marlowe. Me too. Very much. Roland called while Grayson was driving Briar to her Sunday art class, his business partner's voice booming through the car's speaker system with his characteristic complete lack of subtlety or volume control. I heard from 3 separate sources that the date actually happened and you didn't bail at the last minute. Clara told me you came home smiling, which is either genuinely excellent news or means you've finally had the complete breakdown we've all been expecting. Clara talks entirely too much about things that aren't her business. Grayson navigated Sunday morning traffic with the kind of autopilot that came from making this specific drive approximately twice per week for the past 3 years. Clara cares deeply about you and wants you to be happy. We all do, actually. Roland's tone shifted slightly. So, how did everything go? Different and considerably more chaotic than I expected, honestly. Grayson glanced sideways at Briar, who was supposedly reading her theoretical physics book, but was clearly listening intently to his half of the conversation. But we're seeing each other again tomorrow evening. Roland's whoop of pure triumph made Briar look up from her book with eyebrows raised in silent question. I absolutely knew it. I told you if you actually showed up instead of sabotaging yourself, you'd connect with her. Marlowe's genuinely great. Isn't she smart and grounded and doesn't take herself too seriously despite everything she's been through? How well do you actually know her exactly? Met her about 6 months ago through a mutual friend who works at Mass General. She's been working there for approximately 6 years, puts in genuinely insane hours, raises her kid completely alone, and somehow maintains an actual sense of humor about the whole impossible situation. Roland paused, and his voice shifted to something more serious and waited. She's been through absolute hell, Grayson. Very similar to what you experienced. I thought maybe that particular shared experience would matter to both of you. It does matter. Significantly. The admission felt important and slightly dangerous. I just don't want to build an entire relationship foundation solely on shared trauma and grief. That's not sustainable long-term. Then don't build it only on that. Start with the shared trauma as common ground and then add enough other layers until you've constructed something that can actually stand on its own merits. Roland's bluntness carried the particular kind of hard-won wisdom that came from 15 years of close friendship and business partnership. You genuinely deserve this kind of happiness, Grayson. Please don't talk yourself out of it before it even really begins. The office welcomed him Monday morning with its completely usual demands and crises. Hartwell Properties occupied the entire 42nd floor of a downtown building that Grayson himself had renovated approximately 5 years ago, back when transforming neglected spaces into something beautiful felt like genuine creation rather than cold financial calculation. Roland found him roughly an hour into his attempted paperwork siege, dropping into the expensive chair across from Grayson's desk with the easy familiarity of someone who'd earned permanent access years ago. We need to talk about the Riverside project situation. Grayson looked up from a zoning variance document that was giving him a splitting headache. What about it specifically? Community meeting is officially scheduled for December 15th. The residents are organizing actual protests. Roland slid a folder across the polished desk surface, and Grayson opened it to find photographs of neighborhood meetings and handmade protest signs. The displacement issue is getting serious traction with local media and community organizers. The Riverside project represented their single biggest development initiative in 3 years, $45 million to purchase a cluster of aging apartment buildings in South Boston, demolish them completely, and replace them with luxury condominiums targeting young professionals and affluent empty nesters looking for urban convenience. It was the standard gentrification playbook executed with just enough community relations budget to make it seem palatable and responsible. Except it wasn't actually palatable at all. 340 families would lose their long-term homes, offered exactly $5,000 each in relocation assistance that wouldn't even begin to cover first and last month's rent anywhere else in Greater Boston's increasingly expensive housing market. Grayson had signed off on those specific numbers because the underlying math worked beautifully for their profit margins, because this was just business after all, because transforming neighborhoods inevitably meant some people got left behind in the process. What specifically are they asking for? Substantially better relocation packages for displaced families. Dedicated affordable housing units in the new development itself. job training programs for displaced residents who want to work in construction or property management. Roland ticked off the demands on his fingers with practiced efficiency. Basically, all the usual things we say we'll seriously consider and then completely ignore once the protests eventually die down and people move on to other causes. Grayson stared at the photographs with growing discomfort, actual faces of real people who would be forcibly scattered by his personal decision to prioritize maximum profit over community continuity. An older woman with deeply lined features holding a sign that read, "Been here 40 years, where am I supposed to go?" A young mother with 3 small children clinging to her legs. Her expression mixing righteous anger with barely suppressed fear. A teenage boy whose handwritten poster demanded in large letters, "Why do poor people always lose?" What if we actually did it this time, the affordable housing units, I mean? Roland's eyebrows climbed dramatically toward his hairline. That would cut our overall profit margin by approximately 18%, minimum. Then we accept an 18% reduction and move forward anyway. Grayson, we have actual shareholders who expect reasonable returns. We have a board of directors. We have people who've invested serious capital expecting us to maximize profitability, not run social welfare programs. Roland leaned forward with obvious concern. This isn't a non-profit charity organization. We also have more than enough capital reserves to absorb a temporarily smaller margin and still come out significantly ahead financially. Grayson pushed the folder back across his desk with sudden determination. I'm genuinely tired of being exactly the kind of ruthless developer who displaces struggling families just so wealthy people can have granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. Where is this actually coming from? Roland studied him with the focused intensity of someone conducting a diagnostic examination. Yesterday afternoon, you were completely fine with the Riverside numbers and projections. Today, you want to restructure the entire financial model to prioritize social responsibility. What changed overnight? Grayson thought carefully about Marlowe's specific address in Dorchester, about her building that had probably been genuinely nice once, and was now just barely functional survival, about the way she'd said with quiet dignity that, "We do what we can with what we have available to us." I met someone who lives in exactly the kind of place we routinely demolish without thinking twice. Someone who works 60+ hours every single week and still can't afford anything better than aging buildings in questionable neighborhoods. His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. It made me think seriously about who we're actually building for and who we're systematically building against. You're developing an actual social conscience. Roland didn't sound particularly pleased or displeased, just clinically observational. That's either genuine personal growth or serious professional liability, depending entirely on how you choose to handle it. Maybe it's both simultaneously. They spent the next 2.5 hours completely restructuring the Riverside proposal, running endless numbers and scenarios that might potentially satisfy community demands, without absolutely tanking overall profitability. It meant Grayson personally taking a substantially smaller salary for the foreseeable future, meant reinvesting profits instead of distributing. Generous shareholder dividends meant somehow convincing their board of directors that long-term community goodwill and positive reputation mattered more than short-term maximum returns. By the time Roland finally left his office, Grayson's head was pounding with the particular ache that came from trying desperately to reconcile fundamental capitalism with basic human compassion. His phone showed 3 missed texts from Marlowe, all sent during the past hour while he'd been drowning in spreadsheets. First message: I've been thinking about tomorrow night. There's this particular diner in Cambridge that makes absolutely the best pancakes you've ever experienced. Would you be interested? Second message: also, I should probably mention that Beckett knows about you now. He's 8 years old and has extremely strong opinions about his mother dating anyone. Just fair warning in advance. Third message: sorry, that probably sounded more ominous than I actually intended. He's not hostile toward you or anything, just very protective of me, like a very small but extremely serious bodyguard. Grayson smiled and typed his response. Pancakes sound absolutely perfect, and I completely understand protective children. Briar interrogated me extensively this morning over badly burned eggs about every single detail of last night. Marlowe's reply came almost immediately. You actually cook like real cooking. Grace and I attempt cooking with varying degrees of success. The results are generally questionable, but usually technically edible. Marlowe, I'm very much looking forward to judging your culinary skills personally at some point. The easy back and forth felt comfortable in a way that made him slightly suspicious of his own relief. Nothing should be quite this simple and natural after 4 years of emotional isolation and complicated grief. Nothing should feel this effortless when they'd only actually met once, when he barely knew her beyond surface-level conversation. When the entire thing was built on nothing more substantial than one evening of talking and the fragile hope that maybe he could actually do this. Tuesday evening found Grayson standing in front of his extensive closet for almost 20 minutes, methodically rejecting outfit after outfit for being too expensive, too formal, too obviously trying to impress. He finally settled on jeans that were merely overpriced rather than genuinely obscene, and a simple sweater that Eloise had bought him approximately 6 years ago that still fit reasonably well despite time's inevitable passage. Briar appeared in his doorway and subjected his choice to critical 9-year-old analysis before nodding with apparent approval. You look relatively normal and approachable. That's good and appropriate for a second date. I am normal and approachable. You're extremely wealthy and intimidating, Daddy. That's objectively different from normal. She adjusted his collar with the seriousness of a military general inspecting troops before battle. Just be yourself and don't talk exclusively about work, and remember that Marlowe already likes you, or she wouldn't have agreed to see you again after all of last night's chaos. When exactly did you become the relationship expert in this family? I read extensively and watch people and pay very close attention to things. She stepped back to evaluate her adjustments. You're going to be fine. Probably. The drive to Dorchester felt somehow longer than it should have, Boston's evening traffic conspiring with his own building anxiety to extend every single minute. Grayson parked outside Marlowe's building at precisely 6:55, early enough to demonstrate eagerness, but not so early as to seem desperate or overly intense. Marlowe emerged before he could make the final decision about whether to go to her door, wrapped in the same well-worn coat he remembered from Saturday night and moving with the quick efficiency of someone whose time was always severely limited. She slid into the passenger seat with a smile that made his nervousness feel suddenly foolish and unnecessary. Ready for genuinely the best pancakes of your entire life. I've had some legitimately good pancakes over the years. The bar you're setting is quite high. The bar is about to become completely irrelevant, I promise. She directed him confidently toward Cambridge, navigating with the easy assurance of someone who knew Boston's complicated streets intimately. How was your day? Complicated and frustrating. Work is fighting me rather aggressively about wanting to do something remotely decent and ethical. Grayson merged carefully into traffic, hyper-aware of her presence in the relatively confined space. How was yours? 12-hour shift in the ER. 3 separate cardiac arrests, 1 successful resuscitation, and 7 different people who came in with serious medical problems they absolutely cannot afford to properly fix. Her voice carried a bone-deep exhaustion that went well beyond merely physical tiredness. Healthcare in America is such a beautiful, tragic disaster. That sounds incredibly heavy to carry. It absolutely is. But someone has to actually do this work, and I happen to be stubborn enough to keep showing up day after day. She pointed to an upcoming left turn. The diner is approximately 2 blocks that way. Prepare yourself for atmosphere that genuinely hasn't changed since 1972. The diner announced itself through flickering neon signage that carried the weight of authentic vintage character rather than calculated retro aesthetic. Inside, cracked vinyl booths and worn formica tables created exactly the kind of completely unpretentious space where food quality mattered infinitely more than superficial ambiance, and absolutely no one cared what you wore as long as you tipped reasonably. They claimed a booth near the large front window sitting across from each other with laminated menus they didn't actually need because Marlowe had clearly already decided for both of them. A waitress appeared almost immediately, older woman with genuinely kind eyes and the particular look of someone who'd been doing this specific job long enough to have developed strong opinions about customer behavior. The usual Marlowe sweetheart, "Yes please, but ×2 tonight, with extra syrup on both orders." The waitress nodded with obvious approval and disappeared toward the kitchen, leaving them alone in the warm cocoon of diner noise and cooking smells. Marlowe leaned back against the vinyl with visible relief, relaxing properly for what seemed like the first time since entering his car. "This is genuinely my place, where I come when I desperately need to remember that good things still exist in the world." Her gesture encompassed the entire space around them. "Beckett and I have dinner here exactly once per month right after I get paid and can actually afford the minor splurge." The casual mention of careful budgeting felt like a gift of trust. Grayson traced invisible patterns in the water condensation on the Formica surface, choosing his words with deliberate care. "Thank you for bringing me here and sharing this with me. Thank you for not immediately suggesting somewhere with actual cloth napkins and intimidating wine lists." Her smile carried genuine relief and gratitude. "I spent basically all of yesterday worrying that you'd want fancy and expensive and I'd have to pretend that's my normal world. Fancy stopped feeling remotely important around the same time I realized that money doesn't actually fix anything that genuinely matters in life. Look at you developing actual perspective and wisdom." The gentle teasing carried real affection underneath. "Must be genuinely nice to have enough money that you can philosophically decide it doesn't particularly matter." The observation stung precisely because it was completely accurate. "You're absolutely right, and I apologize. That was privileged and thoughtless and stupid." It was honest and only slightly stupid. Marlowe's expression softened considerably. "I'm not trying to make you feel guilty about being financially successful. Just pointing out the obvious reality that money solves very different problems for very different people." "What specific problems would it solve for you if you had more of it?" The question clearly landed heavier than Grayson had intended. Marlowe looked out the window at Cambridge traffic crawling past, something that looked like longing and resignation crossing her tired features in quick succession. "Time, mostly. If I actually had real money, I could work fewer hours and spend genuine quality time with Beckett instead of desperately shoving parenting into whatever tiny spaces exist between hospital shifts. Maybe sleep occasionally instead of running on caffeine and stubborn determination." The pancakes arrived before Grayson could formulate an adequate response. Absolutely massive stacks with butter melting into golden pools and syrup that smelled authentically like real maple instead of corn syrup imitation. Grayson stared at his plate, genuinely confronted with more food than any reasonable person could possibly consume in one sitting. "You weren't kidding about life-changing. Wait until you actually taste them before making final judgments." Marlowe cut into her own stack with obvious enthusiasm and long familiarity. "Fair warning, if you don't genuinely like them, we probably can't see each other anymore. I have standards." The pancakes exceeded every promise. Impossibly light and fluffy with perfectly crisp edges, sweet without being cloying, exactly the kind of simple perfection that came from someone genuinely caring about their crit. Grayson ate in reverent silence for several minutes, savoring something that felt almost like a small miracle verdict. Marlowe watched him with anticipation that suggested his answer actually mattered significantly. "You were absolutely right. These are genuinely devastating. I may legitimately never eat breakfast anywhere else again." "Perfect. Now we officially have a place together." The casual declaration carried significance that went well beyond the actual words. Our place where we can come and just be completely normal humans. Normal felt like possibly the best thing anyone had offered him in years. They ate slowly and deliberately, conversation flowing naturally around and through the meal. Marlowe told genuinely horrifying and simultaneously hilarious stories about ER disasters and bizarre medical cases. Grayson shared details about Breyer's latest scientific obsession with quantum mechanics that she definitely didn't actually understand, but discussed with absolute unshakable authority. Somewhere between generous second helpings and refilled coffee cups, Marlowe's foot accidentally touched his under the table. Not quite intentional, not quite random accident either. Grayson pressed back gently, and this small point of physical contact felt like meaningful acknowledgement of something genuine building between them. "Can I ask you something personal?" Marlowe's voice dropped slightly lower, creating intimacy through volume rather than content. "Of course, absolutely. What actually made you say yes to the blind date in the first place? Roland mentioned he'd been trying to set you up with various people for months." Grayson thought carefully about that specific morning, about Breyer's insistence, about 4 years of unrelenting grief that wasn't getting measurably lighter with time's passage. "My daughter told me very directly that simply surviving wasn't remotely the same thing as actually living. She was completely right, and I was tired of pretending she wasn't. Beckett told me I was setting a terrible example by being alone and isolated. He said if I genuinely wanted him to make friends and be social, I needed to practice it first myself." Marlowe's laugh carried both affection and real pain. 8 years old and already considerably wiser than I'll probably ever be. They're smarter than we are about most things, honestly. They've had to be smart and aware. We inadvertently made them that way through our own grief and struggles. She withdrew her foot suddenly, the loss of contact feeling oddly significant. "Sorry, that got dark quickly. Please don't apologize for being honest and real with me." Grayson reached deliberately across the table, palm facing upward in clear invitation. "You can absolutely be dark with me. I'll understand completely." Marlowe took his offered hand without hesitation, their fingers intertwining across the table with surprising ease. "This is moving quite fast, isn't it?" "It absolutely is. Does that scare you?" "Terrifies me completely, but staying stuck and isolated scared me considerably more." They remained like that while the diner gradually emptied around them, two people who'd learned far too young that life came with absolutely no guarantees, finding tentative hope in shared pancakes and honest conversation. When the waitress finally brought their check with a knowing smile, Grayson paid quickly before Marlowe could even consider protesting, leaving a tip generous enough to make the older woman's eyebrows climb with surprise. "You significantly over-tipped. She deserves it for making pancakes this remarkable. Or you're showing off. Maybe both are simultaneously true." Outside, Cambridge had turned cold enough that breath created small fog clouds. Marlowe leaned against the passenger door instead of immediately opening it, looking up at Grayson with an expression he couldn't fully interpret. "I want to keep seeing you, but I need you to genuinely understand that my life is complicated and messy, and I don't have any room for games or manipulation. I want to keep seeing you too, just honesty and pancakes and figuring this out together one day at a time." Marlowe rose on her toes deliberately and kissed him with the kind of certainty that came from conscious decision rather than random impulse. Her lips were soft and tasted faintly like syrup and coffee. The kiss brief but undeniably significant. When she pulled back, her eyes searched his face for something he desperately hoped she found. "Okay then. One day at a time together." Saturday morning arrived with crystalline cold that made Boston feel somehow older than its actual years. Grayson woke early, nerves transforming restful sleep into restless anticipation. Today they would visit Marlowe's actual apartment, allow Breyer and Beckett to solidify whatever tentative friendship they were building, navigate the delicate choreography of merging worlds that had learned to function in careful isolation. Breyer appeared in the kitchen before he'd finished his coffee, already fully dressed and practically vibrating with barely contained energy. She'd chosen her outfit with unusual care, jeans without any holes and a sweater that actually matched her hair, pulled back in a style that suggested she'd consulted YouTube tutorials. "Do I look okay? Not too fancy, but also not like I don't care at all about making a good impression." Grayson surveyed his daughter with the seriousness her question absolutely deserved. You look perfect. Beckett will definitely appreciate the effort you've put in. I'm not trying to specifically impress Beckett. I'm trying to make Marlo think you raised me correctly and that I'm not some spoiled rich kid. She poured herself orange juice with surgical precision. First impressions matter tremendously, even second ones. Technically, this is our third time meeting them if you count the playground. Third impressions matter just as much. She drained her glass and placed it carefully in the sink. Are you nervous about this? Should I be nervous? Probably yes. We're going to Marlo's actual home where she lives with Beckett. That's genuinely intimate. You'll see how she really exists instead of the carefully curated version she shows on dates. Briar tilted her head with uncomfortable perceptiveness. Are you actually ready for that level of realities? The question deserved real consideration rather than dismissive reassurance. I think so. I hope so. Good, because backing out now would be genuinely mean and you're not a mean person. They drove through Saturday morning traffic that was slower than weekdays but never truly quiet in Boston. Grayson navigated familiar streets while Briar provided running commentary on everything from weather patterns to quantum mechanics to her specific concerns about whether Beckett would like the book she'd carefully selected for him. What if he's already read it? What if he thinks my taste in books is immature and babyish? Then he'll politely accept it anyway and you'll survive the disappointment. Grayson took the exit toward Dorchester. Not everything has to be absolutely perfect, sweetheart. But I want him to genuinely like me and think I'm interesting. He already likes you. You made him actually smile at the playground, which Marlo said was apparently quite difficult to achieve. Briar subsided into unusual silence, fingers worrying the edges of the wrapped book. Grayson recognized his own deep anxiety reflected perfectly in his daughter's nervous fidgeting. Both of them carrying hope that felt simultaneously fragile and absolutely essential. Marlo's building looked different in full daylight, less ominous, but certainly no more prosperous. Brick worn by literal decades of weather windows that had clearly been replaced piecemeal over many years. The kind of structure that housed actual lives rather than comfortable aspirations. They entered through a door that stuck slightly climbed stairs that creaked under their combined weight. Navigated a hallway that smelled like cooking and lives lived in very close proximity. Number 2C appeared on their right door, painted a cheerful yellow that contrasted sharply with institutional beige walls. Grayson knocked hard, doing something complicated behind his ribs. Footsteps approached, the lock clicked open, and Marlo appeared with a smile that transformed his anxiety into welcome. You found us successfully. She stepped back, gesturing them inside. Come in, please. Ignore any mess you see. I cleaned obsessively for 3 hours, but somehow it still looks chaotic. The apartment revealed itself gradually. Small living room with mismatched furniture arranged for function rather than aesthetics. Kitchen visible beyond compact and organized with the efficiency that came from limited space. Handmade decorations suggesting someone who created art. From necessity, who found beauty in what was available rather than what money could purchase. Beckett stood near the couch, formal and watchful, wearing what appeared to be his absolute best clothes and the expression of someone preparing for rigorous examination. He held a book, fingers gripping pages with white-knuckled intensity. Briar crossed to him immediately, offering her wrapped gift with earnest enthusiasm that bypassed self-consciousness entirely. I brought you something. It's the next book in the Percy Jackson series. I thought maybe you'd want to read it after finishing book 3. Beckett accepted the package with careful hands, unwrapping it like the paper itself held significant value. His face transformed when he saw the title, genuine surprise, giving way to something that might have been joy if 8-year-old boys felt comfortable admitting such emotions openly. I've been wanting this specific one. Mom said we'd get it next month after she got paid. Now you have it this month instead. Briar bounced slightly on her toes. I also brought book 5 just in case you read really fast. Want to see your room? I want to know what other books you already have. The direct request bypassed whatever careful protocol Beckett had prepared. He glanced at Marlowe, received a small encouraging nod, and led Briar toward a door at the apartment's far end. They disappeared inside, voices immediately rising in animated discussion about mythology and heroes, and whether the movies did the books any justice whatsoever. Marlowe closed the door behind Grayson, leaning against it with visible relief. That went considerably better than I expected. I was worried Beckett would freeze up completely. Briar has a genuine gift for bypassing normal social awkwardness and anxiety. Grayson took in the apartment properly now, noting details that spoke of care within severe constraint. Your home is genuinely lovely. It's small and old, and the heat barely functions in winter. Marlowe moved into the kitchen, gesturing for him to follow. But it's ours, and the rent is actually manageable, and Beckett's school is within walking distance. The kitchen barely accommodated both of them, counter space minimal, and appliances dating from an era when avocado green was considered fashionable. Marlowe filled a kettle with practiced efficiency muscle memory. Navigating space she knew intimately. Coffee, tea, I have juice boxes if you're feeling adventurous. Coffee would be wonderful, thank you. Grayson leaned against the counter, hyper-aware of proximity in the confined space. Thank you for having us here. I know this is a lot. It's terrifying and necessary simultaneously. She pulled mugs from a cabinet, chips and ware marking their surfaces. Beckett barely slept last night. He came to my room 3 separate times to ask what-if questions about today. What kind of questions? What if Briar decides she doesn't actually like him after seeing where he lives? What if you're secretly mean and I'm too lonely to see it clearly? What if we all try being a family and then you leave just like his dad left? Her voice caught painfully on the final question. I didn't have good answers for any of them. I don't think there are good answers to those questions. Grayson accepted the coffee she offered, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. Just honest ones. I'm not secretly mean. Briar genuinely likes Beckett regardless of where he lives, and I'm not going anywhere unless you explicitly ask me to leave. Marlowe met his eyes over her own mug, searching for something he desperately hoped she found. What if I do eventually ask you to go? What if this gets too complicated or too difficult, or I panic and sabotage everything? Then I'll leave, but I'll hope you change your mind and give us another chance. He set down his coffee and took her free hand deliberately. I'm not interested in forcing something that doesn't work naturally. But I am very interested in trying until we know for certain. Trying sounds absolutely exhausting. Staying stuck sounds considerably worse to me. She laughed, the sound carrying both tension and genuine release. You have an answer for absolutely everything. I have uncertainty disguised as confidence. There's a significant difference. They stood in the small kitchen with morning light filtering through windows that needed cleaning. Drinking coffee that was slightly burnt and listening to their children's voices rise in enthusiastic debate about whether Athena or Poseidon was the superior godly parent. The simple domesticity of it struck Grayson with unexpected force, this glimpse into how life could potentially function if he let someone into the careful structure he'd built around 4 years of grief. Marlowe's phone buzzed against the counter, shattering the moment. She glanced at the screen and her expression shifted from relaxed to tense in the space of a single heartbeat. I need to take this. Work emergency. She answered with professional efficiency, listening to whoever spoke on the other end with growing concern. How many victims? When did it happen? Okay. Yes. I can be there in 40 minutes maximum. She ended the call and met Grayson's eyes with apology already forming. Mass General, multiple car accident on Interstate 90. They're calling in all available staff. I have to go immediately. Of course, absolutely. We can leave right now. No, please. The word came sharp and desperate. Could you possibly stay with Beckett? I don't have backup childcare on weekends, and this could take many hours. She was already moving toward her bedroom, pulling out scrubs with practiced speed. I know it's asking a lot, and we barely know each other, but my neighbor is visiting family, and I literally don't have anyone else, and… Marlowe. Grayson stepped into her path, hands on her shoulders, grounding her through touch. Yes, of course I'll stay. Go save lives. We'll be completely fine here. Relief and uncertainty warred across her features. You're absolutely sure Beckett can be difficult with new people and the apartment is small and we'll manage perfectly. Briar will help. Go be a nurse. He squeezed her shoulders gently. Do you need anything before you leave? Just promise you won't let them burn down the building or adopt stray animals or make any major life decisions. I promise no fires or unauthorized pets. The life decisions thing is negotiable depending on circumstances. She changed in record time, emerging from her bedroom in scrubs and fierce determination. Beckett appeared from his room at the commotion, immediately taking in his mother's work clothes with the resigned understanding that suggested this happened far too frequently. You have to go to work. I'm so sorry, baby. Emergency at the hospital. Marlo knelt in front of her son, hands cupping his face with tender certainty. Mr. Hartwell is going to stay with you and Briar until I get back. Is that okay with you? Beckett's gaze shifted to Grayson, conducting assessment and suspicion mixing with something that might have been tentative trust. How long will you be gone? I genuinely don't know. Several hours at minimum. She kissed his forehead, leaving a moment of contact that spoke of promises and apologies. Be good. Listen to Mr. Hartwell. I'll text when I know more about timing. She grabbed her bag and disappeared in a whirlwind of efficiency, leaving Grayson alone in a strange apartment with two children who were suddenly his complete responsibility. The door closing behind Marlo sounded louder than it should have, finality settling into space she'd occupied mere moments before. Briar emerged from Beckett's room, immediately assessing the situation with uncomfortable accuracy. Marlo had to leave for work. Emergency at the hospital. She'll return when she can. Grayson looked at Beckett, who'd gone very still and quiet. Your mom said we could hang out here until she gets home. Does that work for you? I guess so. Beckett's voice came small, stripped of the cautious openness he'd shown earlier. She leaves a lot. For work. People need her more than I do, I think. The statement landed like accusation and resignation, combined an 8-year-old's understanding that the world made demands his mother couldn't refuse. Grayson recognized the sentiment from Briar's early years, those nights when Clara put her to bed because he was closing deals and choosing work over presents. Your mom wishes desperately she could stay, but saving lives is genuinely important work that matters. I know that. Beckett moved to the couch, sitting with defeated posture. Dad used to leave for work too, then he left forever and didn't come back. The raw pain in those words could have filled entire libraries. Briar sat beside Beckett without asking permission, her presence offering comfort where language inevitably failed. She didn't say it would be okay or that his mom would definitely return or any of the empty platitudes adults deployed when confronted with children's legitimate fears. Instead, she said quietly, My mom died when I was 5. I used to think if I was better or smarter or less annoying, she would have stayed somehow, but dead isn't a choice people make. Your dad didn't choose to leave you. Beckett looked at her, something shifting in his serious face. Mom says he died being brave, saving someone else. That means he loved other people enough to risk absolutely everything, including you. Briar's wisdom exceeded what any 9-year-old should possess. It's completely okay to be really mad about that. I'm not mad at him. I am sometimes. At my mom for dying. At my dad for not being there when she crashed. Briar picked at the couch's worn fabric. Being mad and being sad can happen at exactly the same time. Grayson stood in Marlo's small living room, watching his daughter offer comfort he'd consistently failed to provide, feeling simultaneously inadequate and profoundly grateful. Hours passed in careful domesticity. They had pizza for lunch. Beckett insisted on medium size only. No expensive toppings, strict adherence to his mother's budget rules even in her absence. They watched a movie about dragons that Briar declared scientifically inaccurate but entertaining. They built elaborate Lego structures that violated physics but satisfied imagination. Somewhere around 5 p.m., Beckett fell asleep on the couch, mid-sentence, exhaustion claiming him with the sudden totality unique to childhood. Briar covered him with a worn blanket, maternal instincts emerging without prompting. "He's tired a lot." Her observation came quietly. "Mom says grief makes you tired even when you sleep enough." "Your mom is absolutely right about that." Marlowe called at 6:30, voice tight with exhaustion and something darker. "I'm leaving the hospital now, but I need to tell you something before I get there." The tone triggered immediate concern. "What happened?" "One of the accident victims died during surgery. A mother with 3 kids under 10. Her voice fractured slightly. "We did absolutely everything right, but sometimes everything right still isn't enough." "I'm genuinely sorry. That's devastating." "I'll be there in 20 minutes. I just wanted to warn you that I might not be great company right now." She paused, breathing audible through the phone. "Thank you for staying with Beckett, for being someone I can actually call when everything goes completely wrong." "I'm glad I could help." Grayson meant it completely. "Drive safely. We'll be here." He prepared simple dinner, grilled cheese and tomato soup, the comfort food Briar insisted was scientifically proven to help with sadness. When Marlowe finally arrived, she moved slowly, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. Beckett ran to her immediately, small arms wrapping around her waist with fierce possessiveness. "I'm sorry I was gone so long, baby." "It's okay, Mom. Mr. Hartwell stayed and we had pizza and watched movies and he made you dinner." Beckett's words tumbled out in relief and pride. "We made grilled cheese, the good kind." Marlowe looked at the set table with tears she tried unsuccessfully to blink away. "You made me dinner," Briar insisted. "Apparently grilled cheese is scientifically proven comfort food." "It's completely true. I read it in a book." Briar pulled out a chair with hostess authority. "Sit down, please. You look like you desperately need to sit." They ate together at Marlowe's cramped table, 4 people who barely fit but somehow made it work. The food was simple but exactly right, comfort without pretension. Marlowe ate mechanically at first, gradually relaxing as warmth and nourishment worked their combined effect. Afterward, when Briar insisted they should leave and let Marlowe rest, Grayson walked them to the door. Marlowe caught his arm, pulling him slightly aside. "I want to see you again. Soon. But I need you to genuinely understand that my life is like this. Unpredictable and messy and full of emergencies I absolutely cannot control. My life involves board meetings and business crises and a daughter who thinks she knows everything." He touched her face gently. "I'm not scared of messy chaos." "You should be." But she leaned into his touch. "I'm a lot to take on." "So am I. Let's be too much together and see what happens." She kissed him, then brief and desperate, seeking reassurance through connection. "Text me when you get home." "I will absolutely. Get some sleep." The following week brought Monday's text from Roland that dropped like a stone. Board meeting moved to December 15th instead of 20th. Theo wants to address Riverside situation sooner. Prepare your defense thoroughly. 5 days. He had 5 days to convince the board that community welfare mattered more than maximum profit, that his sudden conscience wasn't just emotional weakness disguised as strategy. Thursday brought an unexpected lunch invitation from Theo Winters. "We should talk before the meeting. Tomorrow at noon." The message felt like both opportunity and trap. Grayson agreed anyway. That evening, Marlowe called instead of texting. "Beckett asked me tonight if you were going to be his dad." The statement landed like physical impact. "What did you tell him?" "That adults don't work that fast. That we're dating and we like each other, but becoming family is complicated." Her breathing sounded uneven. "He said he already decided you were family because you made me grilled cheese when I was sad." 8-year-old logic is hard to argue against. "Grayson, I need complete honesty. Are you ready for this? For a relationship that comes with a kid who's already getting attached? Because if you're not, I need to know now before he gets hurt worse." He thought about Beckett's serious face, about Breyer's enthusiasm for their friendship, about Marlowe's apartment feeling like home despite being foreign territory. I can't promise perfection. I'm going to make mistakes, but I'm ready to try. I want to try. That's either the bravest or stupidest thing you've ever said. Probably both simultaneously. They talked until Marlowe's exhaustion pulled her towards sleep. Grayson sat in his quiet townhouse afterward, thinking about tomorrow's lunch with Theo and the board meeting that would follow. Friday's lunch happened at an expensive restaurant downtown. Theo Winters sat at a corner table, silver hair, perfect suit, probably costing 5 figures. They made small talk through appetizers neither touched until Theo's patience expired. I'm offering you a way out of this disaster you're creating. I'm listening. Withdraw the Riverside restructure. Present the original proposal with healthy margins. Keep your position and reputation intact. Theo's voice carried experience and authority. In exchange, I won't bring a motion of no confidence. And if I refuse, then I'll make the case that you're emotionally compromised and unable to lead effectively. The board will vote. You'll lose. Theo leaned forward. I don't want to do this, Grayson, but I can't let personal relationships destroy what we've built. What if this isn't about personal relationships? What if I've genuinely realized our development model is harmful? Then you're naive and forgot that business exists to generate profit. Theo's bluntness carried no malice. You want to help poor people, start a charity. Don't tank a profitable company. I'm not withdrawing the proposal. Then you're a fool. Theo stood. The board meets at 3. Make your case, but understand you're about to lose everything for a woman you barely know. The board meeting started precisely at 3 p.m. 12 members around polished wood with expressions ranging from curious to hostile. Grayson presented his restructured Riverside proposal for 20 minutes affordable housing units. Job training, relocation assistance that actually helped families. The slides showed community impact balanced against profit. When he finished, silence filled the room. Finally, a woman near the end spoke. This is admirably compassionate. It's also financially irresponsible. The attacks came steadily. Board members questioned his judgment, his motives, his fitness to lead. Theo orchestrated opposition through strategic silence. Finally, Theo spoke. I'm calling for a vote. Either we approve Grayson's restructured proposal or reject it and proceed with the original plan. 3 hands rose in favor. 9 opposed. Motion fails. Theo's voice carried no triumph. Grayson, given this vote, I'm formally requesting you reconsider your position as CEO. The board has lost confidence. Resignation would be graceful. The alternative is forced removal. Grayson stood before 12 people who'd decided his conscience was liability. I won't resign. If you want me gone, vote me out. So be it. Call the vote. Should Grayson Hartwell be removed as CEO? 9 in favor, 3 opposed. 15 years ending in a conference room on a Friday afternoon. Effective immediately, I'll assume interim CEO responsibilities. Theo extended his hand. You built something impressive. I'm sorry it ended this way. Grayson shook the offered hand. I'm not. Sometimes endings are new beginnings. He cleaned out his office while Roland hovered. Personal items went into a box too small for 15 years. Photos of Breyer Industry Awards, Eloise's fountain pen. What will you do? Roland asked quietly. Figure out what comes next. Build something that actually matters. Outside, Boston greeted him with indifferent cold. Grayson loaded his box and sat behind the wheel processing what had happened. His phone rang. Marlowe. How did it go? I got fired. Voted out technically, but unemployed effective immediately. Silence stretched between them. When Marlowe spoke again, her voice held absolute certainty. Come over. Let me make you grilled cheese. We'll figure out what comes next together. Grayson started the car, Boston's evening traffic a blur. He'd lost his position, his title, 15 years of building. But driving toward Dorchester, toward Marlowe's grilled cheese and Beckett's tentative trust in a future he couldn't predict, he felt lighter than he had in years. Sometimes losing everything meant finding what actually mattered.